What would you do if, after weeks at sea, only one final inspection separated you from your home? But the physician isn't looking at your cargo. He is looking at you. He raises a finger and points to a small lump on your neck. And in that instant, your world ends. What would you do if you were sentenced to the island from which no one returns? Imagine the salty smell of the sea, but mixed with something else. A sweetish, nauseating stench. The breath of disease. And beneath it all, the harsh, chemical smell of quicklime. Listen to the distant echo of bells from a city you can see, its towers and palaces silhouetted against the sky. A living, bustling city that you can no longer touch. Beside you, the only sound is a dry, deep cough and the murmur of desperate prayers. Feel the rough fabric of the quarantine clothes on your skin, which burns with fever. Feel the cold stone of a cot that is not your own. It is the absolute contrast between the vibrant as wealthy Venice in the distance and the oppressive silence of your new, tiny reality. This is not a literary invention or the plot of a horror film. This was the reality for thousands of people during the centuries of the plague. This is the story of the LAZARETTO. What you are about to hear is not just the story of a disease. It is the chronicle of daily life in the world's first quarantine center, an island designed to separate the living from the dying, and how humanity tried to survive when it was already condemned. To understand why such a place existed, you must travel to the Venice of the 14th and 15th centuries. The Black Death of 1348 had swept through like a hurricane, decimating nearly half of Europe's population. But the Black Death was not a one-time event. It was the beginning of an age of terror. The plague returned in waves every few years, unpredictable and lethal. And Venice, the most serene republic, was the most vulnerable place in the world. A commercial superpower, a crossroads between East and West. Its ships brought silks, spices, and riches, but also, hidden in their holds, came death. The panic was constant. Every ship that appeared on the horizon was a potential death sentence for the city. In response to this fear, the Venetians, pragmatic and organized, created one of the world's first public health institutions, the Magistrato della Sanità. Its power was nearly absolute. Its logic, brutal and direct. To save the body of the city, you must amputate the infected limb. The survival of the community was placed above the life of the individual. In the year 1423, the magistracy made a drastic decision. They transformed a small, isolated island in the lagoon, named Santa Maria de Nazareth, into something new, a place of containment. They called it the Nazarettum. Over time, the name would become corrupted, mingling with the biblical figure of Lazarus, the resurrected, until it became Lazaretto. But make no mistake, this was not a hospital designed to cure. It was a place of waiting, a sanitary prison, a purgatory on earth where those suspected of carrying the plague were sent to see if they would live or die. This small island became the symbol of a city's desperate fight for survival. A wall of water and fear built at the cost of sacrificing its own citizens, often based on nothing more than a suspicion. Arrival at the Lazaretto was a bureaucratic, cold, and dehumanizing process. Once the physician's finger pointed at you, you ceased to be a person and became a problem to be isolated. Imagine the journey. You are not in an elegant gondola, but on the plague barge, a coarse, functional vessel. The only sound is the splashing of oars in the lagoon's murky water and the impenetrable silence of the guards. They wear beaked masks, their empty eyes gazing at you without expression. As you draw closer, the island takes shape. You see its austere, fortress-like buildings, and you see the smoke, plumes of thick, dark smoke rising lazily into the sky. It is not the smoke of kitchens. It is the smoke of funeral pyres. Upon disembarking, you are stripped of everything that connected you to your former life. Your merchant's clothes, your jewelry, the letter from your wife in your pocket, the lucky coin that accompanied you on 1,000 voyages. Everything is confiscated. Some of it will be burned. The rest, submerged in vats of vinegar or smoked with sulfur and aromatic herbs in a desperate attempt at purification. You are handed a rough, anonymous tunic. Your identity has been erased. But the most terrible revelation comes when you enter the courtyards. You don't just see people with the unmistakable signs of the plague, the black buboes on their necks and in their groins. You also see healthy people, their eyes filled with panic, because the island was not just for the confirmed sick. They sent the suspects, anyone who had been in contact with an infected person, and they sent entire crews from ships arriving from suspect ports, forced to complete a preventive 40-day quarantine, the quarantina. Thus, in this confined space, the dying mingled with the terrified healthy, the condemned with the innocent, all locked together in the same cage, breathing the same air thick with fear and, possibly, with disease. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Shock, denial, impotent rage, and then the swift, cold realization that the rules of the outside world, your social status, your wealth, meant nothing anymore. You were no longer a merchant, a nobleman, or a craftsman. You were a number, a body in waiting, and your only task was to survive the passing of the days on the island from which almost no one returned. Inside the lazaretto, life was governed by a strict and monotonous routine designed not for living, but for waiting. Waiting for recovery, or more likely, for death. The day began at dawn. You would wake in one of the large common halls called tessoni, rows of straw cots where dozens of people coughed, moaned, and prayed in the gloom. The air was thick, stagnant. Breakfast was always the same: a watery soup, almost without substance, and a piece of hard bread. The smell of the miserable food mixed with the permanent stench of sickness. Then came the moment of greatest tension: the inspection. The physicians, often second-rate or foreigners hired for this job that no one wanted, would pass among the cots. They were not looking to cure you. They were looking for new symptoms, a new bubo, a spot on the skin, a higher fever. Their visit could mean your transfer to the section for the moribundi, the last step before the pit. The rest of the day was a void to be filled. The constant sound of coughing, the laments of the suffering, and the dull, rhythmic thud of the gravediggers, shovels outside, digging new pits. And through the barred windows, the sight of the sun shining on the lagoon, the sails of merchant ships passing in the distance, a cruel reminder of the life and freedom that had been stolen from you. The island operated on its own system. At the top were the priores, the administrators appointed by the Magistrato della Sanità, then the guards, who ensured no one escaped, the physicians, with their protective masks, and at the bottom, the inmates. Sometimes, the inmates themselves were recruited for the most thankless tasks: caring for other sick people, washing their clothes, or the worst of all, helping the gravediggers carry the bodies to the mass graves. In return, they received an extra ration of bread or wine, a terrible choice between dignity and survival. All life on the island depended on the supply boats that arrived from Venice with food and fresh water. Any delay due to a storm or a holiday meant hunger, adding another layer of suffering to the already unbearable reality. But even in this place of despair, people clung to normality with incredible strength. Those who still had energy would smuggle small objects, a knife, a piece of cloth. They wrote letters to their families, knowing they would probably never be sent.
Sealed and kept in the hope of a miracle. They played dice using small animal bones or pebbles, or they would simply sit for hours, in silence, gazing at the silhouette of Venice on the horizon, counting the bell towers, naming the churches, trying to keep the connection to the world that had cast them out alive in their minds. Now stop. Stay on the island for a moment. Feel the cold. Hear the silence broken by a cough. A man, a merchant from Crete, prays softly,
Asking the Virgin for one more day of life. His only possession is the memory of his children. Now, jump. Cross the kilometer of water that separates you from the city. You are on the Rialto Bridge. The air vibrates with 1,000 voices. Merchants shout the prices of pepper from India and silk from China. The smell is not of death, but of spices, of fried fish, of perfume. Enter a palace on the Grand Canal. The night is lit by hundreds of candles. The music of lutes fills the air. Nobles dressed in velvets and brocades drink wine from Murano glass goblets. They laugh, they conspire, they fall in love, completely oblivious, or perhaps choosing to be, to the drama unfolding so close by. Now, return to the island. In a single leap, the silence, the gray, the smell of vinegar and death, the merchant's prayer. This physical and psychological abyss was the essence of the lazaretto. To be so close to life, to beauty, to wealth, and yet to be so infinitely far away. to be a ghost watching a world that no longer belonged to you. The torture was not just the disease, but the proximity of a paradise lost. The medical treatments in the lazaretto did not aim to cure the plague. No one knew how. They sought to manage fear, isolate the contagion, and, at best, alleviate symptoms based on the science of the time, a mixture of observation and superstition. Imagine the scene. The physician, or more often a barber surgeon, approaches your cot. His face is hidden behind the famous beaked mask, filled with aromatic herbs like rosemary, cloves, and ambergris. It was not to protect against germs, a concept that did not exist, but against the bad air, the miasma, which they believed transmitted the disease. The first remedy was almost always bloodletting. With a lancet, they would open a vein to balance the humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, whose imbalance was thought to cause illness, a debilitating procedure that often hastened the end. Then there were the buboes, the swollen and blackened lymph nodes. They were treated with hot poultices, a mixture of onion, figs, mustard, and even arsenic, in the hope that the bubo would mature and burst, releasing the poison from the body. An excruciating pain added to the torment of the fever. The air in the wards was constantly purified by burning juniper and rosemary. Amulets and talismans were prescribed. The metallic sound of the surgeon's instruments, the acrid smell of burning herbs, and the pain of the remedies were the soundtrack to the medicine of fear. But the most important revelation is that the real treatment was the isolation itself. The physician's primary function was not to heal, it was to classify. His job was to decide who was worsening and should be moved to the wards of the incurable, who had died and should be removed immediately, and who, by some inexplicable miracle, managed to survive the 40 days of quarantine. Archaeology has unveiled the industrial scale of this classification. In the excavations on the island of Lazaretto Vecchio, massive burial pits have been found. One of them contained more than 1,500 skeletons, bodies piled layer upon layer, without coffins or ceremony. Men, women, children, the tangible proof of the lazaretto's effectiveness, not as a hospital, but as a machine for processing death. The relationship between patient and physician was a strange mix of terror and a minuscule, almost irrational, hope. The figure of the physician, anonymous and terrifying behind his mask, was not seen as a healer. He was a priest of death, a judge, the intermediary who decided whether your fate was freedom or the mass grave. Despite the horror, the isolation, and the constant presence of death, unexpected forms of community and humanity emerged within the lazaretto. When society has given you up for dead, sometimes the only thing you have left is the connection with other condemned souls. Imagine small acts of kindness in the midst of hell. An inmate who has received his water ration shares a sip with the man in the next cot, whose throat is too dry to ask for it. A woman who, at night, whispers stories of her village to distract the others from the fear of the dark. On the island, the rigid social barriers of Venice vanished. A nobleman and a sailor, a banker and a seamstress, were now equal before the disease. Unlikely bonds were formed, alliances forged in shared suffering, where the only currency was a gesture of compassion. But the inmates did not only fight against the disease, they fought against a second death, oblivion, to be erased from history, to die as an anonymous number in a mass grave, and their weapon against this fate was the walls. Archaeologists have found dozens of graffiti on the walls of the lazaretto. Names, dates, crude drawings of ships they long to sail again. They are messages in a bottle cast across time, a desperate cry that says, "I was here, I existed, remember my name." Think of the story of an unlikely friendship, perhaps between a rough Dalmatian sailor, strong as an oak but terrified of the fever, and a young Venetian scribe, physically weak but with the strength of his wit. The scribe would read to the sailor, and the sailor would use his strength to get him an extra ration of bread. They cared for each other, sharing stories and hopes, until one morning, the scribe would wake up and the sailor's cot would be empty. These small, anonymous tragedies were the true fabric of life on the island, the proof that even in the darkest place, the human need for connection never truly dies. In one of the mass graves of Lazaretto Vecchio, archaeologists found something that chilled the blood, the skeleton of an elderly woman buried with a brick forced into her mouth. It was not a random act of violence. It was a ritual, an exorcism. This discovery opens a window into the mentality of the era, into the mix of panic, science, and superstition that defined life and death in the Lazaretto. In the folklore of medieval Europe, there was a belief in the Nachtseher, or shroud eaters. It was thought that some plague victims did not rest in peace, that in their graves, like vampires, they would chew their own burial shrouds, magically spreading the disease from beyond and calling their relatives to death. When the Lazaretto's gravediggers, upon opening a mass grave to add new bodies, found a bloated corpse with decomposition fluids seeping from its mouth and a hole in its shroud, their terrified minds did not see a natural process. They saw a shroud eater, and the remedy was as brutal as the belief: to insert a stone or a brick into the corpse's mouth to physically prevent it from continuing to chew and spread the evil. The vampire of Venice, when was not a monster. She was likely an old woman, one of the first victims of a new plague wave, whose body was desecrated by the fear of the living. This small, macabre finding tells us more about the terror of the era than 1,000 written chronicles. The end of the quarantine had only two possible outcomes, and one was immensely more likely than the other: freedom, or the mass grave. On one hand, death, a swift, efficient, and anonymous end. The gravediggers, immune or resigned, would wrap your body in a sheet and carry it to the pit. There was no ceremony, no family, no tears, just the dull thud of your body falling onto others, and then the crunch of the quicklime they threw over you to hasten decomposition and prevent contagion. An end without a trace, without a memory. But on the other hand, there was the miracle, survival. If after 40 days you were still alive and without symptoms, the physicians would declare you clean. They would give you a small document, the Boleta di Sanità, a bill of health that was your passport back to the world of the living. Imagine that feeling, stepping onto the boat again, but this time heading towards Venice, feeling the sun on your face, not through a grate, but freely. The first bite of fresh food, a piece of fruit or cheese, after weeks of watery soup. The overwhelming sound of the city that is now not a torture, but a welcome. You have come back from the dead, but freedom was bittersweet. The Lazaretto left scars that could not be seen. You returned to a world that had given you up for dead. Perhaps your family had perished. Your business, gone. Your house, occupied by others. And people looked at you with suspicion. You had been on the plague island. Were you truly cured? The stigma followed you like a shadow. The Lazaretto did not only kill the body, it could destroy your spirit and your place in the world. The story does not end when you leave the island. Think about that survivor. What is it like to walk the same streets, cross the same bridges, knowing that just a kilometer away, on that island that now seems so peaceful, hell continues to exist for others? How do you sleep at night, knowing you have escaped a fate that continues to devour hundreds of people just like you? The Lazaretto marked you forever. Imagine for one last moment the island at sunset. The sun sets behind the palaces of Venice, painting the sky in gold and purple. But from the shore of the Lazaretto, that beauty is a mockery. The smoke from the pyres rises slowly, and the only sound is the gentle lapping of the lagoon's water against the walls of an exile from which almost no one will return. That island was not just land surrounded by water. It was a purgatory on earth, a tangible border between hope and oblivion. The story of the Lazaretto is more than a tale about the Black Death. It is a testament to what we do when faced with collective fear. It teaches us about sacrifice, the cruelty of pragmatism, and the incredible human capacity to seek connection and dignity in the darkest of places. It is a reminder that behind every quarantine, every measure of isolation, there are individual stories of loss, fear, and an unyielding will to be remembered. If you found yourself in a similar situation, what small personal item would you try to keep at all costs to not lose your identity? Tell me in the comments. If this journey shook you, subscribe to this channel. Here, we don't just tell history, we relive it.